Alright, so part two of the mini-series Blues Music, and today we're talking about how we got from the Mississippi Delta Blues to the electric sound of the Chicago Blues. So today you're going to learn how we got from the deep Mississippi South to the northern Missouri and Illinois states with the blues. That's what you're going to get today, so stick around for that. Alright, so hello, I'm Donald Witt, the bass instructor of the How to Play Bass online course at iwannaPlayBass.com. Subscribe, get your free membership and your free ebook on setting up your bass. And this is I Wanna Play Bass, your YouTube channel. Subscribe there, hit that bell notification, get in the loop and don't miss a beat. I've got a series going on, a 5-part series going on of the blues music, which is very interesting from the beginning of the blues to the now evolution of the blues and the bass guitar, with some stuff in there about the bass guitar as well, how we got this baby here. Okay, so definitely enjoy. Okay, so how we got the blues to the northern states of America, and that was in that time was considered the Great Migration between 1910 this all happened between 1910 to the 1930s. It was the largest movements ever. That wasn't an ethnic fearing execution or anything like that, but this was such a rapid movement. It's considered the Great Migration. That's from 1910 to 1930. But it had to do with, there's a few variables that it had to do with. The cotton plantations were being eaten up by this boll weevil that was tearing up the fields and the plantations. So the African Americans were finding themselves, out of work, and they needed to find work as well. So they migrated north. They took off and headed north to the industrial, at that age right then, the industrial age was taking off in Illinois and Missouri, all the northern states. So a lot of big stuff was happening in those states. So they all migrated that way, and it was just pretty amazing how it happened, but it happened, and it's made history, the Great Migration. So that's how the Delta Blues got taken to the northern states and turned into because that Great Migration was actually from like 1910 to 1970, so it seemed like a long period of time, but it really wasn't for that amount of people to migrate. But that's how they migrated to the northern cities for work, and they took their blues music with them, the Delta Blues, and that's when we got the St. Louis Blues and the Chicago Blues. And at this time we were evolving in our music. A lot of recordings were taken off in Chicago, as I'd mentioned in the last video. Blind Lemon Jefferson did his first 2 recordings in Chicago, and early on too, like 1925, he was carried up to Chicago and did the recordings. But a lot of interesting things happened in that time period. Fender came along, electrifying these guitars and these basses, and that's how we then turned into the Chicago Blues. So that's when we started getting electric guitars, electric basses, and stuff like that. The electric bass came along because it needed to be amplified. It was being played on the upright bass. The double bass was all acoustic. In the 1920s, the bass wasn't heard. You couldn't hear it over the drums or the banjo or the other guitars. So something needed to happen. That's when it, like you'll see in orchestras, the bass, you'll always see the bass, the cellos, the violas sitting up front. They're in the front row so they can be heard. They still set orchestras up from the same as they did years ago because of that reason. The basses needed to be put somewhere that they could be heard more. But in the jazz style, they had the smaller ensembles, so the bass still couldn't be, you could sit the bass in the front of the room and it still would struggle competing with the drums and the guitars. So that's when they decided they needed to electrify, they needed to amplify the bass, and that's when they came out with the electric bass, which was Leo Fender in like 1950. So when that happened, that's when the Chicago Blues started taking off, and blues started to get a totally different feel and just a totally different style of its own. And as parallel with the Chicago Blues, you have the St. Louis Blues, which was taking a route too, which was Chuck Berry and Johnny Johnson, his writer. Those two worked together, and Johnny Johnson was quite an innovator, along with Oliver Sane and Ike Turner. These guys had a lot to do with turning that blues into the rock and roll, which Chuck Berry had a whole lot to do with that, just in his presence and his performance of that of the blues in that style. But Johnny Johnson had a lot to do with the writing of Chuck Berry's. They worked together as a team, and Johnny Johnson was the writer of that, but Chuck Berry was the artist of it all. So it worked out well, and that's how we got rock and roll from that. And that's why I say blues has an influence on most of our music. It branched off to the country, to the rockabilly, to rock and roll, and the British blues really popularized it with the big bands like the Who, Led Zeppelin, as I mentioned, Cream, Eric Clapton, and there's just so many more. All the British Rolling Stones, the Beatles, big names. All of their style was from these blues. The Beatles had the rockabilly background and the blues as well. And that's how that all evolved about the same time. And that's how they popularized it so much. And then once it got here, then you had the big names like Elvis Presley and James Brown that really took it to a different level. Elvis Presley took it to the rock and roll side, and James Brown took it to the rhythm and blues side. And you had those two genres born from the blues as well, and then many more subgenres of those genres. So, the blues has influenced a lot, most of the music today. So that's how we got the electric blues. The Chicago blues is considered the electric blues because about that time in Chicago, that's when they started amplifying things and started making that electric sound. And you'll find the basses now from 4 strings to 11 strings. They've got tons of strings, and as I've mentioned in other videos, the bass has gone from the 4 string, initially from the 4 string, and there was a 5 string way back in the days, 1950s. They came out with a 5 string as well, but they had a high C on it instead of a low B. They had a high C, and it didn't take off that well. It didn't do that great, so they stopped making them until later on in the 70s. Larry Johnson came along and made it a 5 string, got with Alembic and GHS and said, listen, let's make it a low B. Let's make this bass a little lower, and that's when they started making a low B, and that has stayed since that way. But they still make the 5 string. You can find a 5 string with high C. It's a lot of jazz performers do it for chords and melodies and solos and stuff like that. They still use the high C on those basses. So that's kind of how the bass has evolved a little bit, in a nutshell, how the bass has evolved into the electric bass. And goes back to the blues. The blues has created that whole idea. And the big guitarists like B.B. King, electric guitar, been around for a long time, and he was one of the first electric guitar players of the blues then. But definitely the blues was definitely popularized by the bigger names like the Led Zeppelins, the Bob Dylans, and all of that. And through the civil rights movements, Bob Dylan and the civil rights movement, in that time, just singing the blues being of that idea just of what it is, the blues, singing the blues. And those were trying times for American culture, and blues was right there, performing, and just it was on the underlying part of it was the blues lying there as well. So it has helped shape American culture through all the civil rights and all the terrible times we've been through, and which it's inevitable. Times are just it's that way. So it has, and it's unfortunate. So that is the blues. Got part 3 coming up in the next video. So hope you enjoyed that. If you did, help me help you. Hit that like button, and I'll catch you all on the flip flop in the next video. So bye for now.